I think it's really been a productive day. And so right now is the town hall. It's the time to speak up and say what you're worried about, what you're concerned about, what you've heard. There are lots of experts in the audience, so I don't claim to have all of the answers, but I thought I would just say sort of my perspective on this. I've thought about this for a very long time. I had 2 boys with Duchenne, and they, well, other than my big fight with Jerry Mandel about a steroid trial in which each of those boys would have been randomized to an arm, when we had the argument in the hall that they should be N = 1. So my sons were never in trials. And so when I look back over the last 25 years, I say, what have we got? We've got steroids, right? We still don't know dose and regimen. We don't know the time to start. We don't know the time to stop if we should at all. So we have to do something different so that we can accelerate the pace, so that we can increase the numbers in this, so that we can increase the ages, so that when we get approvals, people aren't fighting their insurance companies. But I know it's not easy, and you heard today from everyone that this is pretty complicated. And internally, we've also talked about, long ago, it seems like, when this community wrote draft guidance for the FDA, I thought it was an amazing community effort. We started with a steering committee. We divided that steering committee into working groups, and then we had a community advisory board that kept advising us about that. And so when that was submitted, it was truly our community that did that guidance. And so I'd really like to think about this as a community effort where we're trying to be inclusive, we're trying to expand the age and stage that's in this, and we're trying to move to combinations. I also want to say that I think in our community, because dystrophin is absent, if you could get dystrophin back in, that's what you'd want to do. And that would be your priority. And I think in terms of how people think about choosing for trials, their first trial would be a dystrophin expression, whether that's exon skipping or gene therapy or anything in between. If you can get dystrophin back, then that's a really good plan. So I think as this evolves, the first drugs, hopefully, that will go through are going to be the downstream drugs, the anti-myostatins, the antifibrotics, the anti-inflammatories, the mitochondrial biogenesis drugs. Those kind of drugs that affect those inflammatory pathways and all the targets and all the complicated biology that occurs then. If we could get that, we could maybe get to a child who's been in a gene therapy, get on a combination drug, a person who's got exon skipping in a combination drug. So that's how I see this evolving. I'm not in charge, clearly, and I'm sure everyone's thankful for that, because I think this takes a village to get done, and a village of really smart people, all who've spoken today. So I'd like right now as a town hall to take all of your questions. I don't know that I can answer them, but I will point to people in the audience who can. So let's begin. Questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, and just incredible conversation today, and wonderful, wonderful input. I have 2 questions, but first I just want to, first of all, Deborah Miller, Cure Duchenne. I just wanted to start with just a real brief comment. There are several comments today about the burden of trying to decide about which trial to go in, and we talk to hundreds and hundreds of families all the time, and they're very curious, and they want want information about the trials. I never hear the word burden. I always hear that they are empowered, and then they want to learn, they want to know more, and they want guidance on how to research and make that decision. But I just think it's maybe more empowering to be talking about helping the families make these decisions instead of talk about the burden.
Okay, well, I'll give you my perspective, and then hopefully we'll hear from others in the audience. I think I too have spoken to a number of parents over the years, and what I have learned from parents is that initially, there's an extraordinary enthusiasm. You get accepted into a trial. It's going to be fabulous. There's a lot of excitement, and then there's a lot of obligation on the part of families, and they're traveling every single week. And I think from the perspective of what has to happen, you have to have an employer who's willing. You have to have, if you have other children, you have to have a support system for the other children, or you're bringing them along, at which time you have to keep the other children occupied while this child in the trial goes through the trial process. And they're expensive. And I know that many of the companies have been extraordinarily generous with their support. But I don't know about you, but I bribe my children and now my grandchild all of the time to make things happen. And so I think the initial enthusiasm sometimes gets tempered by the burden of the consistent requirement of the trial. So that's just my perspective, and the perspective I've heard. And I also have heard, and I'll tell you a story we've had repeated, is that there are a number of young boys in trial. That's what we're talking about, right? So this one little boy was in a trial, and It was about 9-10 months in, and they had been going weekly to this to get the testing done, and then it was stretched out over time, and then it was every few weeks. So there was a time that he got to school, and he was ordinarily a very kind, quiet child, and he got to school and he got not so kind and not so quiet. And so he really struggled with his teachers, and he struggled at home. He was really throwing things around at home, and his dad called us several times and said, what am I going to do? And I just said, well, first of all, I did my regular, I'd bribe him, I'd do this, I'd do that. But then I said, I think I would just sit down and sob and say, I don't know how to help you. And it turns out that this little boy said to his dad, you promised me magic medicine. We went into the trial, and I had to leave school, so I didn't get to see the shows that my friends watch, so I'm missing those shows. And then I came home, and I'm going there frequently, and I'm still not the magic medicine. I'm not like my peers. So I'm wondering when this takes effect. And so I think I agree with you that it's enthusiasm, but I also agree that there is substantial burden on these little ones to go to a trial frequently, to have these assessments, and to do all they do. They do it for us because they know we want to do the best for them. But I think the parents, I wonder about burden. And so I'd love anyone else to comment on that, if it's enthusiasm and then burden, or no burden at all, so I'd love to hear.
Can I clarify something first? I was referring to the burden of a decision of which trial to go into.
Okay.
And so I think there's a difference between trying to make that decision, being overwhelmed with a decision, versus the actual being in a clinical trial.
Okay, so I'll answer that in my perspective too, and then ask. I've seen parents that get pretty burdened about if they have a lot of opportunities. I've seen parents really struggle if they have no opportunities, and everything in between. I think that, I guess when it comes to choice, I'd like to know whose choice it is. And so I'm one of those kind of people that ask everyone for the definition of the term. So when you're looking at choice, is it you, the parent's choice? Is it the child? Granted, they're young, but some of them are teenagers, so do they make the choice? Is it the PI of a given site that says, I picked you for my trial? Because we hear that too, right? I think that you'll be great for this trial. So I think in choice, it's hard. I think there's so many wonderful opportunities to think through which is the best for me, and then which do you qualify based on the functional ability, based on the age of your child, based on the willingness to do testing. I'm not saying it's not worth it. I'm just saying there's a lot to think about. And I think that there's a range of parents. There are some who say, I know XYZ trial is going to be the best, and that's what I'm aiming for. And then I know other parents who are pretty probably overwhelmed. So love for people to talk about that, because, again, I haven't been in a trial.
Can I, as long as I have the microphone, can I ask my question then?
Sure.
Sure. So regarding the data sharing, I'm assuming that this data that you're gathering from through IACT, well, then the sponsors will have access to their trial data, correct? And that the placebo data will then be transferred and used through Critical Path for research. Is that
This
correct?
is a question for Jane.
Jane.
Jane, come here.
Sorry, Jane.
We have a data sharing question for you. Do you want to repeat it, Deborah?
Yeah, so Jane, sorry, hi.
Sorry, I was having a side conversation.
So regarding data sharing, so each sponsor will have their own data, proprietary data,
Yep.
correct? But will that also reside in Critical Path for analysis and to be contributed to your overall research?
So a lot of those decisions have not been made yet, but the idea is for the platform trial there'll be a common database. Within that database, each sponsor would have access to their drug arm data and the shared placebo data for analyses. Each sponsor would not have access to any other sponsor's data. And that's the bottom line of what we've decided so far. What is an open question was what Billy was hoping for is that as much data as possible, certainly the placebo and eventually the drug arm data might be transferred to something like the CPATH databases, which can then be shared to the degree that each individual sponsor agrees to share. And I don't think everyone in the room understands the de-risk database, which right now, some of the data is shared for just the use of FDA and CPATH for specific purposes. Some of it's available to anybody who wants access to the data. So that would have to be agreed with the individual sponsors as to how they wanted their data shared. But in terms of the placebo data, I don't think we've actually decided that yet.
Okay, and then you mentioned having that data also fill a registry. And would that data, if the parents requested for their data to be transferred to a different registry, would it be available to go to a different registry also?
Again, we haven't really had that granularity of discussion, but I can't imagine why not. And the data belongs to the patients.
Right. Okay, all right, thank you.
And Deborah, can I just add one thing? The first time you
Sure.
asked that question, you implied that the data went to IACT. IACT does not
No,
have any, okay, to do
goes
this.
from the CRO to.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
Well, I have a comment I could make about my perspective of having an 18-year-old. It feels very, very late in the day for us. And, you know, if I could turn back the clock and tell young parents, you can't believe how fast time goes. You know, I used to think that we had all the time to be in a trial, and suddenly it's gone. So there's two things about this platform study or trial that I really love. It includes the whole range of patients, which I think answers a huge problem that we've been complaining about for a long, long time. It includes the more progressed patients, the older patients, the non-ambulatory patients. And the other thing that has been so frustrating for me to see is non-filled trials. You know, we don't know what is going to be a hit, what's really going to make a difference. And we have so many trials that aren't filled. I see this as a great opportunity for that. You said it great, Carly, you know, drop the mic. It's all about time. It's the most important thing. So I just have a question about where is the money coming from to do this?
Well, so we and IACT have been supporting this for this, where you see it today. We're trying to discuss, or we will be discussing, the particular model. There are all different models of funding. It could be a consortium of this community who donates, sits on steering committees, and moves it forward. It could be in other ways that we're thinking. So we are thinking through, how do you support such an endeavor? So to be fair, we're just thinking models. You know, what's the model? We unlike ALS, we would love someone to come and toss a chunk of cash at us. And if you find that person on the way out, have them chat with us. But there are all sorts of ways and people that are interested in this moving forward. And so we're hopeful that foundations will come together. There's 46 or 9 or 50 foundations in the Duchenne environment. There are lots of different companies in this environment. And we all know people who may be interested in supporting such an endeavor. And so I don't think, I always said to my sons, money can't stop us from doing what we want to do, right? Because they had so little time here. So I think I can say the same thing to you. If that's our only problem, we'll have to solve it. There's lots of other complexities.
One more comment about the burdens. An interesting thing happened to me when my son got older. I was always all about the trials. Get him in a trial, get him in a trial, get him in a trial. And when he turned about 16, I started including him in those conversations. He didn't want to be in a trial. I mean, that's a huge burden on me, because I'm like, what? You know? And he's like, I don't want to miss school, and I don't want to put in the time and have a placebo, and I'm happy, and I don't want to get sicker. I don't want to die prematurely because of a trial. You know, I think these boys have their own thoughts about these things, and it's you can't just say, I'm making all your decisions until you turn 18. These are their lives, and it is a burden. I feel burdened by these decisions. So that's just my own personal opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Just to piggyback off of what Mindy said, I too felt burdened by trials. And first, with the decision of making which trial was I going to put him in. I mean, I remember the first conferences I went to and going into Dr. Finkel with all my Post-it notes on the little PPMD and him just taking a deep breath, but going through each one with me. And then we're so blessed, right? We are so blessed with all those options. Mm-hmm. But were we as parents making the right decision for our 5-year-old? You know, was this the right one? What if we put him in it and a couple months later, the best and biggest thing to come in the Duchenne world popped up? Did we blow that shot? So there was a lot that went into it. But we didn't want to make regrets, so we accepted that burden and we moved on with it, and we were happy with it. But I will say, as Brendan got a little bit older, for instance, when he was invited to screen for gene therapy, having that long talk about expectations and the fact that this was a trial and this was an experiment. We didn't use words like magic medicine. We were very honest with him that, hey, Brendan, we hope this works, and we hope, this is what we will see, but there's a chance that won't happen. And, sitting an 8-year-old down and having that conversation was heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. But we felt it had to be real to avoid what you just explained. So,
Ellen?
I too thought the idea of a trial was a huge burden. It's what kept me up at night. What if we make the wrong decision? What if there's only one shot? What if we, like Colleen said, what if we pick A and B wins the race? It was heartbreaking to me. I mean, and in our case, my son was on Adelorn, PTC 124 back in the beginning, so there weren't a lot of choices then. The choice was steroids, no steroids, what age do you start steroids, and that was a hard enough decision. And then, do I want my child to be one of the first 12 children in the world to take a medication that is going to act on his DNA? That is an imposing question. And he was 6. He didn't get a vote in the question. It was my husband and I. But it was very difficult. And now that there's so many choices, I think that burden is greater. And so the idea that you can access quickly more than one treatment, I think the most exciting thing I've heard today is that you can be on a stable dose of an approved medication and have the opportunity to try something that might make that medication work even better. And that's so encouraging. And I did not really foresee that happening this soon. So I think this is a really positive way to move forward.
Thanks, Ellen. Other comments?
Okay. Hello, I'm Maria Jose. I'm mother of Franco, 5 years old, and Julian, 2 years old. Both of them are affected by Duchenne. First of all, thank you very much to all of you who have been working for so long on this. I'm really excited, and it's super hopeful, as Carla said. I just wanted to bring the voice of my 5-year-old son here to the table, since parents have had the opportunity to speak out on academics and science and researchers and the industry. My son is in a clinical trial with a placebo arm, and we didn't spoke when he explained. When we started going to the hospital, he would ask, "Why am I going? What will the doctor do? Will he give me a pill that will make me run faster, as my friend Simon? Will I be able to climb the slide as my other friends at school?" So we tried to keep it realistic in his age-appropriate language, but we had the experience that because of the protocol of the trial, he, during 30 days, had a very high dose of steroids. And during those 30 days, he could do lots of things. His physical endurance was improved noticeably. He could run faster. And then after those 30 days, he kind of came back to his baseline. So then the conversation was not only about that it could potentially work or not, but why last week I could do this, or why last week I could run faster, and now I'm running slower again. So it's very difficult, not only for us, but primarily for them. They experience on their body the placebo and the burden of being on a placebo arm. And my question is, and this is a very naive question, it's about well, I'm very happy that we are all agree that the placebo should be minimized, but I don't get the necessity of the blinded, the fact that it has to be blinded. Many spoke here of the scientific reliability, and I would love to have an explanation. Because when we are speaking about this kind of physical, criteria or assessments, it's not that because my son will know or I will know he's on placebo, he will run faster or slower in the 100-meter. So just if someone would please explain to me, like if I were a 5-year-old, why is the necessity to have this, the blinded arms?
Well, I think that there's not a parent in this room that would say to you that they like placebo or they think it's useful. And in some of the studies, the gene therapy studies that are now 2-to-1, 1-to-1 studies, I think it's really hard to think about. So, and I think that that is the company and the regulatory FDA in our case. And maybe, Craig, do you want to tell us why you think placebos are okay or not? Blinded placebos, yeah, right.
I think the issue of blinding has to do really with the inherent biases and motivational aspects with a lot of the endpoints. In addition, there's lots of various factors that can weigh into performance that are actually controlled for in the setting of the blinded trial. But I think Billy Dunn was really quite clear today. There are a number of ways to get scientifically valid answers that don't necessarily require double-blinded, placebo-controlled trials. And I think that the whole goal here is to really minimize the exposure to the placebo arms and to try to take advantage of sharing of placebo across arms. I think if you can use historical natural history data, but for instance, validate that data as really providing validation for a small placebo arm, I think that can give the regulatory authorities confidence that the actual placebo arm is in fact reasonable. It can be extrapolated or extended by the use of the historical control data. So I think people are really moving towards minimizing the effect of the placebo arm, but I don't think we're at a point where we can completely abandon the use of the placebo arm. I think the goal here is to minimize it, to try to make use of the historical control data, and to try to get answers as quickly as possible, which also minimize the exposure to placebo data as well. Well, the issue in terms of the blinded, there are inherent biases on the part of the patient if they think they're on a drug, the family if they're on a drug, and even the clinical evaluators if they think if they know the patient is on a drug that could influence the decision that's going into the assessments that are ongoing. A lot of these inherent neuromotor assessments do require some degree of cooperation and motivation. And so if those biases could influence the enthusiasm or the degree of energy and motivation which that child is performing those endpoints, that could potentially impact the scientific answer or the scientific validity of what you're trying to really get at, which is you're really trying to get a scientific answer. Does the drug work or does it not work? I mean, that's ultimately what we're trying to elucidate in as short a duration of period of time as possible.
I think we learned a lot in the 6-minute walk test in the early days, which feel like 1,000 years ago. When the 6-minute walk test first began, remember some sites were encouraging, so they would either let mom and dad in the room and they would encourage, and other sites were being very stoic about just do 6 minutes. And so we did see a difference in there, and we learned that everyone has to be blinded to this, and the parents can't be in because we all want those kids to do well and to do as best as possible. And so we learned a lot looking at that 6-minute walk test to include, I think Nationwide did a study where they bribed those boys with $25 or $50, and they did 100 meters different, right? So I think that's why we all have to be blind, although I think it's human when you're in a trial to try to sneak around, figure it out, try to get some insight, right? I'd probably ask the first 30 people I met, do you think, what do you think? And then you have social media, which I see people commenting that they're in a trial and he looks so good, I bet he's on active, and also, I think the words that we use to describe trials. I've heard someone present and they called promising therapies on the horizon. Well, these are experiments. They're not therapies, and I'm not sure what horizon. But, I think the words we use really matter to each other on social media and also, people who are enthusiastic about their work. I think all of us in this field have been presented with magic more than one time. Look, the mouse is doing cartwheels and so is the dog, and so we'll all be doing cartwheels soon. But We have to temper it a little bit, I think, as we've learned over the years, that it's not as simple as we would like it to be. Other questions, thoughts? Josh,
Hi.
okay.
I'm Josh Argyle. I have a 17-year-old son with Duchenne, and I'm also a community manager for Cure Duchenne. The parents I had talked to over the past few months, they seem not to know a whole lot about the master protocol. And I hadn't seen many parents sharing much about it on social media. So I decided to send a survey to the members of the Duchenne Exchange. As of this morning, there was 210 completed surveys. 92% of the parents, well, I should say, the question was, one of the questions was, it is important for our family to choose the study drug our child receives in a clinical trial? And 92% of the parents said yes. Also, there was another question that listed 7 different factors parents consider when looking at trial enrollment. Of those 7 factors, proof of efficacy from earlier trials was chosen as the first or second most important factor by 63% of respondents.
Can you explain that question to me? Proof of efficacy from a previous trial? What does that
from an
mean?
earlier trial. So if there's a phase 3 study, for example, they would have seen
You mean
signs
the
of efficacy.
the phase 2 data would?
Right, exactly. That would guide their decision. So they would look for efficacy. That was the number 1 factor. And number 2 factor was concerns about safety from earlier trials. And 56% of people had chosen that. So I find it interesting that people really value the knowing what drug they're potentially enrolling in.
Sure.
And here at with the master protocol, we're kind of eliminating that.
Well, no, we aren't exactly eliminating that. First of all, you don't have to join this at all. You don't have to be part of this trial. So that's the first thing. All parents have a choice whether to join or whether not to join. So that's first and fundamental. The second thing is if you choose your first trial, right, and you're in that trial while they recruit, could be 2 years, right? We can talk about some of the trials mentioned today that aren't recruiting, and it's 3-4 hours, or 4 years. So you got 4 years. You got a 24, 36-month study. You've got analysis of the study, and then you got a submission to the FDA. So you're talking about 7 years. In 7 years, at the end of 7 years, I venture to say this young man, unless you have a really terrific drug, is not going to qualify for any other trials. So I'm saying that I think in this community, it's not one size fits all. I think that we have to be disruptive on the trials that come in there to give others the opportunity who are your son's age, who are 18. I think that we can answer lots of questions. In 25 years, actually 35 years, we still do not know the steroid dose and regimen start time, end time. We don't know it, right? So right now we're looking at kids on weekend, high dose, low dose, every day, every other day, pull it behind your ear and do it when you want. That's what I think some of the regimens are. And we still are trying to look through that noise. So all we're saying is this an alternative to try to think about combining trials and get to combinations more quickly? So again, no one will be forced into this trial. Absolutely no one. So if you say, I know the trial that my son's going to get and that's going to be helpful for his condition, have at it. I think that's what you should do. As a parent, I think you have to go with your gut, choose what you think is the most important for you, your son, and your family. And if there's an idea that we could lessen the placebo, widen the inclusion criteria, and we have enough capability to do it, I have to say, why not?
One clarifying question. There will not be trials run congruently, correct? Like within the master protocol and outside of it?
Of course there will be. Of course there will be.
Of the same drug?
Well, not of the same drug.
Okay.
But the sponsors have to decide if they're going to do a trial. Like the gene therapy companies are doing trials right now, right? In general, they're 4 to 7 years old. Solid's a little bit wider than that. And so we don't expect those gene therapy trials to come into that master protocol. Even the exon skipping drugs, whether they come in or not, I don't know. For that matter, a sponsor we want the sponsors to come in, but they're not always going to come in. Or we could look at repurposed drugs, right? People are talking about different repurposed drugs. You could run one of those drugs through there. Tamoxifen is, suggested to be reasonable and a potential anti-inflammatory and a couple other targets. We could look at repurposed drugs and look at them fairly quickly and see yes or no. So again, no one is forced into this. Tomorrow, you're not going to wake up at 8 o'clock in the morning and all of a sudden all the that whole slide that Abby showed will be gone and there'll be this IACT, CDISC, PPMD thing going on because we have lots of work to do. And this is why, so you talk about some of the families who haven't heard about it. You're right. But we've had a webinar. We asked for volunteers. We've talked about this over the last year. I think people weren't thinking about it because we have these number of trials. So the purpose of this meeting today was to really flesh out what is it that we're looking at? Where does it fit? When does it fit? Who does it fit? And to talk about the complexities of starting it with a steering committee. And Ryan and I and Abby have talked about a community advisory board to get more people and more interest in this. So this is something that we think might be useful to this community. The purpose of today is to ask the question, is it an idea to keep going? And I think we have had enough talks today to think this is a viable opportunity to keep going.
Terry Ellsworth again. So I guess I'll be a little bit of a rebel like I am. And I didn't see, and then I'll give you what I think would be Billy's opinion on being in a clinical trial. But things have changed in 10 years. 10 years ago when he was flagged as being a potential candidate for his trial, there was no other trial. His was the only one. So I saw it as an opportunity, not as a burden, his dad and I. And Billy was young. We explained to it. So I saw it as an opportunity. Now, fast forward 10 years, when there are literally dozens of different studies and trials, different story. And it literally, and I'm being honest here, when I read social media and I see parents contemplating, I'm confused and I don't know which trial to go into, I get a smile on my face for obvious reasons. Because to me, that's a beautiful thing that you have a choice of trials today that we didn't have as little as 10 years ago. I think it's awesome. I don't know that I would still consider that a burden. I mean, it's a choice, like you said, Pat. But now if you would ask Billy, is this a burden? Sometimes he says, I hate going to the hospital every week. Why do I have to do this? I said, Billy, you don't have to. I said, there are dozens of other boys that would gladly take your place. Mm-hmm. And then he immediately shuts up. And, oh, don't be dumb. Of course I'm going to go and get my medicine. So, but yeah, I mean, for him, if you asked him, he hates Duchenne. I mean, we do our thing, we advocate, we speak together and do all that we do. But, as well as he's doing, he hates Duchenne. He wishes he didn't have it. And he does hate taking the 2 to 4 hours every week out of his schedule. But he'll do it for obvious reasons. But then getting back to my last question, because I'm still on my platform about the imaging DMD, I wasn't satisfied with how that ended. That trial, my son's been in it 9+ years, as well as many other parents, boys in this room. That's 10 years of data, good data, that's tens of millions of dollars, and for that not to be considered in this platform as an endpoint, I think is foolish. And then the answer was, though, but every site is not set up for that. Every site doesn't need to be set up for that, in my opinion. Build it into the study, the cost of the study, fly them once a year, like we go to Florida or Portland or Philly, and use their equipment. So, I mean, I think that's a very viable solution to that.
So I'm not imaging, and the PIs from imaging, Krista, Lee, and Glenn Walters are not here. So I'll answer you, and then when we talk to them, we may get a different answer. But I think, so the imaging, again, we talked about bandwidth today. Imaging is first of all, going in for another NIH grant, so NIH people here, flag that. So they're resubmitting. They've started. We supported them to start. They had an NIH grant. We had to bridge them. They have another NIH grant and going back for the third round. So, I think the imaging data is spectacular, and what they're learning is pretty spectacular. I don't know if, and I don't disagree that the imaging can predict based on what we see in the quads, and now as they raise up and get into the hips and certainly in the arms. I don't know that the arms are predictive. Craig might know more than that, but certainly the quads are pretty predictive of functional loss. So I don't know. I mean, this would be a discussion, and participating on the steering committee and pushing this point forward is a really good idea, which is why we want people on the steering committees. Because I don't disagree, the imaging is really terrific, and they've done amazing things in those sites. And I know that they have a lot of collaborators. Volker Straub and others in Europe are good collaborators of theirs with the same, not the same software, but it's the same software that's somehow technologically equal to the software that they're using in Florida and other places. So I don't think imaging is a bad idea, but I'm not imaging, so. Okay, Erin.
Hi, my name is Erin Bullers from Houston, Texas. My son Nicholas is 16 and a half, and he's been in a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial for 3 years, and with the 96-week placebo. It was really one of the best days of our lives when he was actually accepted into his clinical trial because he had a chance at receiving a medication. The burden of travel was very difficult on him. We traveled from Houston to Los Angeles every week, so we went from 2 time zones. 8 months into the trial with all of the functional testing, he had a meltdown, crying. He wanted to quit. It was over. He was done. He wasn't going to do any more. And I just, had to talk to him and say, buddy, I just hope that you can understand you need to continue on with this. We have hope that it's going to make a difference in your function. And if you don't continue on, you'll have the risk of losing all your upper body function, not be able to feed yourself and scratch your head, whatever you need to do. And it was just heartbreaking to have to come down to it to get him to stay in, because at 13, they asked for their consent in the trial. And since then, he has kept the course, but it hasn't been easy. We've learned a lot, and I'm just very grateful that we're having this talk today about this platform trial. I think it's needed. He has spent the last 8 years participating in natural history studies. We have yet to even see any and how that data is being used by the FDA. And I just wanted to add that perspective.
Thanks, Erin. And I also think we should, for people choosing the right trials, what we've seen is tadalafil went down, DOMA went down, Utrophin went down. So, those trials weren't successful. And so I hope every trial is successful, but if it's 1 in 10, we have to have more shots on goal. And we have to, even if it isn't the right trial, if we can try a number of trials in a more rapid way, it might be an idea to consider. David.
Yes, I'm Dave Hofstein. I'm a member of the PPMD board. I have a different perspective. I'm the grandfather of a 6-year-old who's in a gene therapy study. I want to make 3 points about the protocol. 1, education. 2 is logistical support. And 3, the steering committee. Education is interesting. We just heard someone talking about how she traveled from Houston to LA, and the difficulty was, my daughter traveled from LA to Columbus. So wouldn't it be interesting if she stayed in LA and someone stayed in Houston? Pat talked, and we've talked a lot about steroids. How many people have struggled with steroids? Deflazacort versus prednisone, weekend versus weekday. Every meeting I go to, I hear 12 opinions about that issue. It's really about education, and the point made about people not knowing what study, Pat, I think a major part of the protocol is going to have to be educating the consumers, educating the parents. So if there are 20 studies going on, what are we going to put online available to parents to make a decision? What are the criteria? So that clearly, I think education has to be a major component. The second one is logistical support. Having just spent 6.5 weeks in Columbus, our family learned that there's a tremendous distinction between the medical care, which is superb, and the logistical support. And I think one of the things, and Pat and I have talked about it, is we should create a model for the logistical support that parents will receive. You know, what's the financing? What's the transportation? What's the role of siblings? What's the financial support? What can you do and can't you do about social media? Can we develop a model protocol that could help people? And also, could we create a minimum expectation to the industry? Because the reality is, for many of these studies, you have to have the financial resources to pick up and leave your home, give up your job, leave your family, and go to a strange city for extended periods of time. And is it really fair that it should only be the wealthy who can afford to do that? Does industry, by becoming part of this protocol, make a commitment to provide that financial support? And the third thing I want to say as a lawyer, we always debate merit selection among judges, and many of us support merit selection instead of elections. But the question I always ask is, who's going to pick the pickers? And it's the same thing here. I think the most critical thing is the big steering committee. Who's going to control it? What's the makeup going to be? How is the decision going to be made? Is it going to be dominated by the parents? Is it going to be dominated by the foundations? Is it going to be dominated by industry? And how are we going to get the balance so everybody finds that fair? It's like creating a new government. And to me, that is probably the single most critical decision of how you structure that steering committee, because everything we talked about today, everything, will come back to that steering committee ultimately making a decision. What should be the criteria? Should it be 5 years old or should it be 4 years old? Well, who's going to ultimately make that decision is going to be the steering committee. So I think the process of that power decision is going to be maybe the single biggest decision.
Yes, well, we're hoping the steering committee, we're expecting it would be widely representative. So I don't know who will make up the steering committee or how big it will be. But typically when I see steering committees, they have a lot of rules and regulations and time to serve and time to take a different position. So I think that we have, with the IACT folks and with the de-risk folks and the group of this community, I think that we can get a pretty powerful steering committee that can really move this thing forward. And that's, I would hope that there would be volunteers to serve in that steering committee in this audience. Where are you pointing, Ryan? Okay, Brian, sorry.
So I'm Brian Denger. I've been in this community now since 1997, and while the amount of clinical trials that are available to families has increased exponentially, one thing hasn't changed, and that's the amount of time. And we don't have time. Even some of the more quote-unquote robust therapies only potentially have modest effect. So we're looking at, in this particular model, looking at trialing drugs that could potentially, combinationally, improve the outcomes for patients. And I think that the faster we get some of those particular compounds approved, or at least trialed and through futility either fail or be able to use them, they're going to be utilized with some of the more targeted therapies. And I think that I came to this meeting to learn what the elements of it would be. And some of the things that I learned were the fact that the placebo arms were going to be smaller and can be utilized from trial to trial. And I think that's remarkable. I think the fact that the futility aspect of it, you can roll kids over from participation in a treatment, a potential trial for a treatment that fails to another trial relatively quickly. And I think that that is remarkable. I know that a lot of families agonize over the aspect of choice, but what choice do we really have? You know, we're a community who are looking for improving the outcomes broadly. And I would never question the altruism of these families, but I think that one of the things that we can look at is, in this particular model, when we have, when we're looking at improving the outcomes for everyone, and this value judgment is being made for us much like it is in our clinical team by a group of individuals with a little more expertise, the potential for us to have success increases. And right now, what I'm hearing is that that potential is going to increase with this particular model. And I'm optimistic that while this is not going to be the only way that clinical trials are going to operate, the potential for this to improve the outcomes across the community are much better.
Alba?
Thank you. The question I have is with regard to what Russell was commenting, that the burden can increase on the site as the number of arms that come in increase. So is it possible that site A goes up and running, they take in A, B, C appendices, it's going on. When the fourth one is coming, it could actually be at a different site that is ready to now accept patients who were not there when you were doing A, B, C. Will that still be considered part, or every site has to be ready to run every arm that comes in?
Typically, at least in the Children's Oncology Network, every site doesn't run every trial.
Right.
And they come in. But where's Scott? Is he still here?
No.
Scott's gone? So we can't answer that today, but I think idea is to,
Actually,
good, Abby, thanks.
No, our understanding, the discussions that we've had, is that every site, in order to maintain the randomization and what that offers a trial, that every site will offer every appendix that comes in. So you will.
That is.
Craig says yes, and someone else says no. No.
So just to add to Abby's answer, is the idea is that every site would randomize to every trial, but only up to a maximum number of patients that they have available. So if you can only recruit 5 patients, you only have 5 patients, and they may be randomized to the same or different arms. Now, again, otherwise you start messing up your randomization if site A is only recruiting for one particular trial.
How do you set up a site?
Can you wait for the microphone?
How do you set up a site that is, in order for it to be able to handle 5, 6, 7 different studies? That means like drug, the placebo for each one of them, for each up to what, 5 patients? That means like an incredible amount of drug storage just to begin with.
But now the sites, some of these sites have 6, how many did you tell me last night, Craig? How many trials were you doing?
When you add the extension phases to trials, I think we're doing upwards of 20 trials. I mean, it's a tremendous
We're not
amount.
talking about every site. It's just a very specific site. Not every site will be able to do that.
But we're also not, I mean,
it's
it
true.
would be remarkable if we could flip that switch and have 5 or 6 trials start immediately in the platform. That's not going to happen. So, this is something that's going to happen organically, a little bit more slowly. I mean, probably significantly more slowly than that. But I think that, when you conceptualize it, you do need to be able to maintain, in order to randomize a patient into the platform, you need to be able to offer all of the trials for the next randomization, right?
Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
they are going to need to have to be able to do them all. I love the horizon that you're painting, where we're going to have like a plethora of trials in the platform. Hopefully, eventually we will, but bear in mind also that those would have been trials that would have been being conducted at sites anyway. So there are going to be a number of sites where, rather than just having, whatever company's clinical trial as a one-off, they would have it in the platform. But there are a lot of logistical issues, and this is one of them, and it's one that we have to take very seriously. But I do think that it's going to be gradual enough that it's not going to be a sudden crisis. It'll be something that we all collectively build to.
Yeah. So
And it'll be a good problem to have.
Yeah, I just want to echo that, exactly that point. So as I said, we're doing this in our AMPLA study. We're starting with 3 drugs.
And the goal is that, we want to have this be a perpetual trial and test many, many drugs, but they're not all going to come at the same time. And some will have ended before the others come into it. So what we're telling our sites, again, this is all in theory right now, right? But what we're telling our sites is likely we're going to start with 3. We may add a 4th, but likely before a 5th comes in, the 1st will be going out. So there may be some patients that they're continuing to follow, but they're not going to all be enrolling at the same time.
Right.
Can I just add one thought? From a bandwidth perspective, and we probably don't do as many as Craig does at his site, but we have a lot of trials, and to do a number of those trials under the same platform actually will really help us in our efficiency of doing those trials. So if I have 2 patients on 5 different trials each, having the same infrastructure underneath all those trials will really help us to increase that bandwidth and actually do it.
I think Steve back there, and then Mindy. Oh, Deanne, sorry.
I have a comment and then a question. In talking about the burden of, I'm a parent from Michigan. I have a son that passed away at 18, and I have another son that's 15. The burden of having sons with Duchenne, and then you add the emotional burden of telling your sons that they're going to be in a trial, and they go to a location, they do all of the criteria to be in a trial. They're excited to participate, only to find out that they don't qualify. The ups and downs in that emotion is difficult and takes a toll on these boys. And when it happens over and over again, it's tough. So if a platform trial like this were an option, I think, and to be able to tell your son they're going to be in a trial and it actually comes to fruition would be something that's very exciting. My question is, if my son was unable to complete one of the endpoints, for example, doing a cardiac MRI was something that was always difficult, does that make him ineligible for the whole platform trial? No. Okay.
Yeah, Deborah.
Yeah, that would not make him ineligible for the trial. So there are going to be, it's going to be a little bit dependent on the appendix trials, right? If ultimately, if a patient can't be in a trial that has a cardiac endpoint, if there's an appendix that's being conducted that targets a cardiac endpoint as the primary endpoint, then they'll build into their eligibility the fact that the patient actually needs to be able to do that. But that's okay, because there'll be the 2 or 3 other trials that are ongoing, which is why the patient would still be eligible for the platform. It's just that that may inform which of the appendix trials they're eligible for.
Here you go.
Steve.
Thank you. Steve Hauschka. I wanted to make a couple of points. First, just hearing the overall plan here as a basic scientist in the field is very encouraging. So I love the overall idea of this platform. In terms of a statement that Jane made about the stakeholders, I think there should be a 4th set of stakeholders, and that it would be the unbiased scientific community, whoever they are, and it's hard to find them sometimes.
True.
Certainly the FDA is a part of that, and they will watch out for toxicity and make sure that appropriate tests have been done. But looking at this from the perspective of nearly 50 years in the field, I can tell you that if you had asked a bunch of good academic scientists about every one of the trials that's ever been done, you would have found some skeptics that would have said, this trial is premature, or these are some things that we are assuming that we don't yet know. And I think that bringing that information into the steering committee at some point, so that the trials, the advantage of a trial can merely be carefully evaluated independently from the enthusiasm of the company, would be good. And that would help parents choose trials. It would probably eliminate a few, And it would help to validate the ones that were going to go forward. And hopefully, it might uncover some aspects of the way the trial was done or the information that needs to be gained that would just make it superior to just charging ahead, because time is so important here. So I would really suggest that you try to get some independent scientific group evaluating the trials that you're going to do. Try to just gather their information, be as skeptical as possible, and in ways that will improve the trial, not to squash them. But all of these trials that have been done, and you brought this up beautifully, we don't have a cure yet. In fact, we don't even really have terribly good ways of ameliorating the progression of this disease. And there are so many scientists who would have said such and such an aspect of this trial is not as good as it should be. And so let's be cautious.
Thank you. And so that means you're on the steering committee, Steve. And I really appreciate that. I think that we were together, 30 years ago in Canada? No, it's 25 at least. Yeah. Well, don't say 40.
So,
when we talked about just these things. So thank you.
I would just add to that point, there are existing resources that can help with that type of review. So Treat NMD has their TACT review, and I sat on that one time, and it was really fantastic process, really multidisciplinary review of the protocols. For me as a scientist, it was really cool to be there and watch that review and see different perspectives. So capitalizing on some of those existing resources can be really significant benefit as well, I think, to the platform.
Yeah, Russ, I don't disagree with you. In fact, when people apply to us for funding, we ask if they've gone through TACT. So TACT, for those of you who don't know it, it's by Treat NMD. It's on their website. The acronym TACT stands for something that I can't remember. But basically, the TACT group meets 2 times a year, and they review. It's a really multidisciplinary group to include regulatory, industry, clinical trials expert, parents, a lot of different disciplines on that. And they go through, and it works very well. The submission comes in, it's reviewed by the people who are going to review it. Then they come together after their reviews are in, and they come together in a meeting, and then they sit for half a day, or a few hours at least, and talk about what they learned. And so as a parent, I've been on that TACT review as well, and I learned questions that I didn't have in my head, right? So I felt the discussion was really, really important. And then they bring the person who submitted the application in, and they sort of grill them. And I've been in both ways. I remember one when the chair of the group said, "Just go find another place." So it was very interesting. And but they really are very serious, thoughtful discussions about what that submission is and its likelihood that it should be in clinical trial. So I totally agree. I think utilizing TACT and having a scientific community here take a look unbiased, I think would be terrific. Mindy.
I think Craig has something to say about that. Did you want to add, Craig? Here. I think
Here it
I've got
comes.
the closest one. Oh.
Okay. Oh, yeah, okay.
We heard today about the importance of taking really a global approach to this. And I think with regard to the European Medicines Agency, there is a formalized process called protocol assistance. It's very similar to their scientific advisory board process. You can actually, they'll convene experts from the neuromuscular community as well as the neurology community, experts from the EMA, and actually give input into a protocol. I think to actually be able to down the road, be able to say that this protocol has been vetted through the EMA protocol assistance process, I think would be great in terms of down the road further engaging some of those European sites and the EMA as well. Plus, it's going to give great scientific input potentially into the process. So I would encourage, ultimately the steering committee in this platform protocol process to consider using that avenue for scientific input on the protocol.
I don't disagree. I think it's very useful at the EMA. Mindy, you're up.
Yeah, I think I talked earlier about the one thing I like about this is that it includes a wider range of progression. So my next comment is from a mother of an 18-year-old and from my position within the Duchenne Family Assistance Program, and we're seeing a lot of issues around reimbursement and access to therapies. And, you know, payers want to only cover the kids that match what was studied in the trial. So I think by including these older patients we're really easing that burden of proof with access too, because we can show that either a drug is working in the older population or that it's not. Because it's very frustrating to parents to have an older kid knowing there's a therapy out there and they can't get it because their kid didn't meet some kind of trial criteria. So by broadening that criteria, I think that will, whether a drug is going to work in an older population or whether it's not, we need to know. So that whole frustration and burden of knowing that you just can't get something for your kid because of a money issue will be alleviated. I think that's something further downstream, but there's a lot of payer issues out there, and we need to look at these older populations if we plan on getting coverage for them.
Right. And then you'd have in a trial like this safety data across the population. So you'd be able to, first of all, for the parents who want to access that particular compound or intervention, they would have safety data, because we know when some of these young men get 18, 19, and into their 20s, they get pretty fragile. So you'd at least be going in, having some safety data, and then making a good decision about whether or not that intervention is useful. So we've come to the end of an hour, and I'm sure there's lots more questions. This is not going to be the last meeting. What, Angela, are you okay? Okay, 10 seconds. 10 second.
You know, I have a lot to say, but really what I want to know, and I didn't hear today, and maybe somebody said it, was from today, what's the time frame? We always talk time, and I know you hate that question.
Yeah, no, because my answer is like tomorrow, but then I say that to my team all the time. Can we just do this tomorrow? And then they roll their eyes at me, and we have to start again. So I think I would like to ask you all. I mean, ultimately, we'd like to be up and running 12 to 18 months. Is that a bad thing to say? Huh? Okay, I say 12. I say 12. All right, we'll say 12. We'll say 12. So you see, I even gave 6 more months, right? I'm saying tomorrow. Yeah, Abby might kill you. But first of all, I love a round of applause. These people, that steering committee has been working forever on this, and they've really... When Abby joined PPMD, she said, I want to do something big, and we said, okay, do this. And so I think that she's gone through sleepless nights and lots of other things, and Ed and Jane and Deborah and Joanne and all the people on the steering committee to bring it this far. This isn't what happens next. Is they're going to go back and discuss the model, how this could work. I'm sure they're going to refine, based on the comments here, some of the protocol development, and then we're going to come out and ask for volunteers. So this time, when we say volunteers, I hope you're all saying, like, I'd serve on a committee, or I'd help you. If this were easy, it might have been done earlier, but it might be an option that saves our sons time and includes more people rather than very young being off the bus, and once you lose ambulation, and get into your adult years being off the bus. So thank you all for joining us. And Tim Franson is from Fairgray Baker and Daniels. We've worked with FBD for, 20 years, 15 years. And Tim is going to wrap up and give you his final thoughts.